Well, it's enough to make you yearn for British Rail. OK, the service was often rubbish and the catering was a national joke, but at least it was simple. Today's railways, with competing companies, franchises, stakeholders and bidders, is so complicated even the Department of Transport doesn't get it. We should have soon been told who's going to run services from Bristol to London for the next 15 years. But now, like so many trains, there are long delays. Here's our train spotter, Paul Baltrop.
Future plans for the West's entire network have been dramatically derailed. A new 15-year franchise should have been awarded within months, bringing big improvements. But a stop button has been pressed. The fiasco over another franchise, the West Coast Main Line, has shown the entire process to be fatally flawed.
What has happened is unacceptable, it's deeply regrettable, and of course I apologise. We have made a big mistake as far as the department is concerned.
Just how big we're now starting to discover.
It's a huge shambles, pouring £40 million of public money down the drain, and until very recently both old and new transport ministers were assuring the public and assuring us in Parliament that this was a robust and proper process.
The train approaching platform 7 is the 1416 Juggernaut Spa service.
In fact, it'll cost us far, far more. For the Great Western franchise, 4 bidders had been shortlisted after years of work. They'll have to start again and be compensated.
If railways ran on water, I think you'd say that franchising's up a creek without a paddle. In terms of what it means, we're really right back at the drawing board of how it's going to move forward. It's very hard to make a judgment how much it will all cost. Some people say, oh, it's just the 40 million that we know the bids themselves cost. If you talk to people in industry, they say 10 times that amount is an underestimate. Perhaps 100 times that amount might be a better figure. We might be talking billions.
Passengers have flocked to the West Railways in recent years, especially the big intercity services. But it's been the small local lines that have struggled, and which the new franchise would have boosted.
What I think is at risk, though, is all the local improvements we were looking forward to in Bristol. More services on the Severn Beach line, maybe a line out to Portishead, lines across North Bristol, and making better use of the railway lines that we already have in Bristol that are closed to passenger traffic.
It's half a century since they last ran regular passenger trains to Portishead. Calls for it to be restored had grown in recent years. They've even done trial runs on the remaining track. Now no one knows when for this and many other improvements.
Things that we as passengers would have benefited from, the promised new vehicles, the promised station improvements, the promised minor infrastructure improvements that can make a lot of difference to daily travel. Those will undoubtedly not happen now. When they do happen, we'll have years of congestion to make up for, years of delay to make up for.
For government, the most immediate problem is deciding who'll run the Great Western Network when First's franchise runs out next June. The solution is bound to be temporary and expensive.
Well, Mike Wheeler is from the Transport Salaried Staff Association. Welcome along. How did we get into this mess?
Well, when British Rail was broken up and privatised, this costly, confusing franchising system was brought in, where we saw the railways fragmented from one organisation into literally hundreds now of train operators, rail leasing companies and infrastructure companies, all in theory all competing. We're in a situation where, because of an incident on one franchise, we're now seeing a complete hold on everything. We've got people don't know what's happening with their jobs. There's risk to the Greater Bristol Metro project and other infrastructure projects that were tied to franchises.
So just how big are the knock-on consequences of this?
Potentially the knock-on consequences could, if the ministers don't effectively step in, and the Greater Bristol Metro scheme could be sunk before it happens, because it was linked to the franchise. A lot of the delivery was linked to the franchise. So we now have to talk about priced options, which means new contracts. We could be in a situation where you end up with what's called a management contract, where the current operator could be paid for a short period to run the franchise past the end of their current contract, and this will lead to stagnation, there would be no incentive for them to invest in the line and actually improve things. It almost makes you wish for a directly operated rail like the East Coast, which I think incidentally in the 2 years it's been running, paid back £450 million back to the Treasury. 93%.
That's one that's run by the government.
That's the one run by the government. 93% of the trains on time, and the only railway line in Britain with a wine list.
I've got a feeling that now you're going to come up with your next point, which is what renationalised the railways.
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily bring back British Rail.
Did you ever use British Rail?
I did indeed. As a boy, I used British Rail. I did. It had its faults, but it was starved of funding by governments. And this is part of the problem with any nationalised industry. The industry isn't allowed to run itself. There's too much political interference, and that's the issue. And if we brought the railway back into public ownership, the actual administration would need to be tightened down.
OK, let's bring our other guests. I mean, John Penrose, I mean, one of the criticisms about your government is the lack of competence, really, in this railway mess is a prime example of it, isn't it?
Well, you just saw the Transport Secretary, Patrick McLaughlin, saying this is a big mistake, and firstly we need to apologise and secondly we need to fix it. What he has done, though, is he's done the right thing. He's announced 2 parallel inquiries. They should report quite quickly. Then we'll know in detail, firstly, what went wrong, because there's an awful lot of speculation, but no one's quite sure. And secondly, what can be done to fix it fast, because some of the options to fix it look pretty awful, but if you can fix some of the things quickly, you can get things back on track, and no one quite knows what needs to be redone and what can be maintained.
Can you believe, Steve Webb, that it happened in the first place, that the government could make a mess on this scale?
It is a mess, there's no denying that, but there is a danger that we're overdoing the gloom here. Just think about the biggest thing that's going to happen to the railways in the West is going ahead, and that's electrification. So, massive project being talked about for years is actually happening, and I've talked to the rail industry people this week. That goes ahead, even if there's problems with the franchise. That's hundreds of jobs in South Gloucestershire with a new depot, it's increased frequency of service, and also smaller projects like on stations are going on, at Bristol Parkway at the moment, there's extra capacity going in. So it's not all doom and gloom. The railways has been a growth area and will continue to be so.
Electrification will go ahead, absolutely, but one of the dangers of the mess with the franchise is if you're changing operator, which it was always set that a new operator would be in before electrification. If it happens partway through, it could actually make a mess, because actually you want continuity through what is going to be a huge upheaval on the railways.
But even if the franchise is delayed, say, 18 months or something, that's well before electrification's up and running.
It's allowing someone to come in bed in, isn't it? You know, this isn't... It's running over
highly
complicated.
Does this matter to the passengers, though, or is it just a behind-the-scenes admin affair, really?
The thing is that
the trains are still running.
But the behind-the-scenes admin can have a knock-on effect to smooth running of the trains, because that admin makes sure you've got drivers in the right place at the right time. It's about ensuring the rosters are done to have people where they need to be, and getting kind of the behind-the-scenes bit. The admin is just as important. If one bit falls, it's such a tight-knit machine, it can bring it all down.
I mean, British Rail, I used it a lot, actually, and, you know, it was a bit of a joke, but it was simple to understand, wasn't it? We all knew, actually, you know, it was one place to get a ticket and it was straightforward. And I seem to remember the trains being sort of OK. The sandwiches were a bit rubbish, but
famously.
Do you think it was wrong to privatise it now?
I think it's too fragmented now. I think that's right. But one of the problems when you have a nationalised monopoly, then, as Mike said, actually, they do get starved of cash, because the government's always going to think, shall we give some money to schools or hospitals or whatever? So hoping that a nationalised rail industry would get all the investment it needs, history tells us doesn't happen. And we have seen investment in electrification. That's happening in a partly privatised system.
Final word.
And also, you know, expecting politicians, even ourselves, not to interfere is just asking too much. Politicians are rubbish at running railways.
OK. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.
Good to see you.